In Colorado, the mysterious abduction of a young mother ends up a brutal homicide. There are few clues and fewer suspects. Now, investigators must try to build their case out of redwood. In rural Minnesota, 4 minutes of grainy surveillance video is the only link to a missing girl's whereabouts. Authorities struggle to put this crucial clue into focus and turn a short length of tape into a life sentence. Anytime, anywhere, people disappear, kidnapped from their daily routines. Predators always leave clues behind. But chasing them takes time. Hampering investigators' attempts to solve these fatal abductions. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Natalie and Matthew Mirabal, their family and friends, spent a fun-filled evening on September 25, 1999. At approximately 8 p.m., they returned to their home in Longmont, a suburb of Boulder, Colorado. They thought the evening was over, but their troubles were just beginning. Later that night, Longmont police received a call from Matthew Mirabal, reporting his wife missing. He said Natalie went to the grocery store for groceries 3 hours earlier and hadn't returned.
That's the last time I saw her. That's the last time I talked to her.
She had to get to your
There he is.
Because Matthew couldn't leave the baby and Natalie took the car, he asked his friends to go to the store to look for her. But they found only her vehicle. No sign of Natalie. She never went into the store. Though 3 hours is not a long time to go missing, authorities were concerned, and a police officer was dispatched to the scene. The officer met the Mirabal's friends in the parking lot. A cursory look inside and in the trunk revealed nothing suspicious.
Thought it'd be best to call you right away.
Thing looks okay here. No.
The only thing out of place was a fresh-looking scratch on the side of the car.
Were these here before? Did you notice?
They found no clue to Natalie's whereabouts.
564 J.
Police impounded the vehicle for closer inspection. Investigator Steve Slauson of the Longmont Police Department and Detective Steve Ainsworth of the Boulder County Sheriff's Office spoke with Matthew Mirabal, who went to the police station to file a missing persons report.
We're doing everything we can to follow through.
He told police that he and Natalie, along with their infant daughter and Natalie's brother, returned to the apartment around 11:30.
No.
Natalie remembered she needed to buy diapers and left for the supermarket. Her brother had already gone to bed, and Matthew fell asleep waiting for her.
She left. It was about 11.
When he woke up 3 hours later, she still hadn't returned. The more police learned, the more concerned they grew about her fate.
She was, belonged to her church group. She had a baby. Her younger brother lived in the house with them. There was nothing to indicate that she would just run off and leave. We had to treat it as a possible abduction. I had patrol officers canvassing the neighborhood, looking or listening for anything unusual. The St. Vrain River runs through town. And so I had patrol dogs working up and down the banks, trying to get all the bases down for a genuine missing persons case.
She wasn't the first young woman to disappear from a supermarket parking lot. In recent months, several women in the area had been accosted or abducted and raped on their way to their cars. The crimes remained unsolved. former prosecutor Trip DeMuth looked for a connection.
We also had reports of suspicious males in the grocery store parking lot. And we had reports at other grocery store parking lots of similar suspicious males. So you have to look at every possible suspect in any given case and chase any lead down. It's gonna lead you to ultimately to the guilty party.
The morning after her disappearance, Natalie's friends were busy putting up posters all over Longmont. They hoped somebody had seen her. It turned out that someone had. 12 miles away, a couple hiking made a shocking discovery. At first, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The female victim was not only dead, she'd been decapitated.
.536 from arrival, 0.8 of a mile up above Buckingham and left.
Detective Steve Ainsworth went to the scene. He joined other area investigators who had already cordoned off a wide area surrounding the victim.
Your uniform officer, I think it's Eric.
The authorities divided their duties to gather as much information from the crime scene as possible. The first assignment, to identify the victim.
It looks like the woman that was missing from Longmont. This clothing is the same, the physical description is the same, the appearance is the same. She has a mark on her ankle, which is described as a Z-shaped mark by her husband, and it appears that she does have that mark.
Her head was found several feet away. The pattern of blood under the body suggested Natalie was cut after her death. Investigators believed she was killed elsewhere and her body dumped here.
It looks like she was probably decapitated right there where she was found, or close by to where she was found. There's a good deal of rage and a good deal of violence associated with this.
Anything lying in the surrounding area was photographed and collected. But despite the best efforts of the police, it didn't amount to much.
There's not a lot of evidence down there. There's the body, and there's not a lot of blood around the area. There's also no immediate evidence of any sort of struggle down here.
But this early in the investigation, nothing could be overlooked. Even a broken segment of redwood board could be a clue, according to Boulder County Detective Tony Matthews.
It was very clean and fresh and not weathered. It appeared to have been recently broken. There was no dirt on it. There was no dust, anything like that. So, again, at the time, didn't have any idea if it really meant anything, but it was just out of place there, and it was close to the body, so it was collected.
Only after all the potential clues were documented and collected was the victim removed from the scene for her autopsy. At a car turnaround area, forensic technicians poured plaster casts of several tire tread marks pressed into the dirt, and hoped that some of them might pay off later. As the crime scene was being processed, a woman found a purse on a nearby road. Inside was Natalie Mirabal's identification, her wallet, and some cash. Detectives now knew the reason for her murder was not robbery.
You and John could do a camp.
Investigators formed a task force to chase all leads. They feared that Natalie Mirabal might be the most recent victim of a serial killer.
There were transients that were being beheaded in the lower downtown Denver area, which is only about 30 minutes away. Decapitations as a general rule are not that common. And so the fact that we had a decapitation here and we had decapitations occurring down in Denver was something that I talked to Steve Ainsworth about investigating.
Detective Ainsworth went to Denver looking for parallels between the cases and compared the killer's MO to the other grisly slayings.
I interviewed the lieutenant of the persons unit at Denver Police Department. We went over my case, went over his cases, and there were no similarities whatsoever.
no similarities meant no leads. The only facts they were sure of came from the victim herself. Unlike the other victims, the autopsy determined she had been struck on the head and strangled prior to her decapitation. And the victims of similar recent abductions were sexually assaulted. Natalie was not. In Colorado, thumbprints were collected from all licensed drivers. This enabled investigators to identify absolutely that the victim was Natalie Mirabal. Once the body was positively ID'd, Natalie's family was informed of her murder.
When I first met Natalie's mother that night, Anselma Vasquez, we notified her that her daughter had been found and she was dead. I didn't tell her what had happened or anything like that, but obviously she was extremely upset.
Well, who did this to her? What?
Investigators next set out to determine whether she was a random victim or murdered by someone she knew. The interviews with her family members revealed Natalie had a happy life and no enemies. Her mother, Anselma Vasquez, remembers her daughter.
She was the sunshine for everyone. You could be in a dark room, gloomy, and Natalie would just make that day so happy and so sunny. And she brought joy into everybody's life.
For Detective Ainsworth, it was at that moment the case became personal.
I told her before I left that night, I told her, Anselma, I promise you, I will find out who did this to Natalie.
For Natalie's mother, and in the name of justice, investigators vowed not to rest until they found the killer. When Natalie Mirabal's decapitated body was found in the mountains, investigators faced two possible scenarios. She was the random victim of a stranger, or her killer was someone she knew. Because most victims know their killers, Natalie's husband, Matthew Mirabal, agreed to allow investigators to search their apartment for anything connecting her to her murderer. According to former prosecutor Trip DeMuth, spouses and family members are always the first suspects investigators try to eliminate.
One of the rules that you follow in criminal investigations is that you start with very small circles and you work out from there. So a husband is always an initial suspect.
Something fell on
During his interview, they noticed a fresh bandage on his thumb.
Something fell on it. Yeah.
Matthew explained he'd cut himself on his job as a house painter. He cooperated with police, letting them photograph the small wound. At this point, investigators checked out anything even slightly out of the ordinary. Detective Ainsworth and his team would have the chance to sort through it all later to determine what might be relevant.
Ron, I might need you to use your flashlight.
Their investigation progressed to Natalie's car, impounded from the supermarket parking lot.
All right, we got some plant material.
The front floor was littered with leaves and twigs.
We'll get a sample of these items on the floor.
Forensic technicians collected all the plant material. Wedged between the seat and the console, almost hidden from view, was a pair of brown cloth work gloves. Detective Tony Matthews questioned the kind of work they'd been used for.
You could see blood on them and started looking at them more closely, and there was a cut, a very small cut in the area of the left thumb.
All of the potential evidence was sent to the lab. The leaf debris from the car was sent to the University of Colorado, where they were analyzed by botanist Jane Bach. Almost anywhere a car travels, it picks up bits of leaves, twigs, and seeds. In this case, the plant fragments left behind were considered possible evidence, as well as clues to the murder's location.
If you look on the floor mats, under the floor mats, and those wells that are where the windshield wipers are, and under the fenders, and in the grooves on tires, all of those places have plant fragments.
In Colorado, different plants grow in different regions. The plants in the high mountains are not the same as the ones that grow at lower altitude.
After we examined these plant fragments, it was obvious that the car had been up one of the canyons around Boulder. I couldn't say exactly what canyon, and it was not characteristic of vegetation found even in landscaping around homes on the plains.
Bach's findings placed Natalie's car at one of the nearby canyons. Agent Scott Pratt of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation attempted to narrow it down to the vicinity of the crime scene by examining the car's tires that were sent to the lab. He compared the tread impressions from the canyon against the tires from Natalie's car. He traced the pattern of the casts onto an acetate overlay. Then he put the overlay against the tires he wished to compare. In this way, he determined whether the model, size, and pattern of the tire matched. These details, called class characteristics, are a good start. But thousands of tires with identical class characteristics roll out of factories every day. It is only when a tire hits the road that the individual characteristics that make each tire unique are detectable.
As we're driving down rocky roads, we may have the rocks take chips out of the tires, or something may put a slice in the tire. They may hit curbs that do damage to the tire. So there's different things that we look at where we can literally nail it down to that's the only tire that could have made that impression.
Investigators usually count themselves lucky to collect one or two impressions of individual characteristics. In this case, Pratt considered himself more fortunate than most.
What was interesting is that I had 4 different tire impressions that I was looking at. As I did my examination, I came to the conclusion that this particular vehicle could have made 3 of them.
Through his efforts, Pratt could confidently say Natalie's car had been to the canyon where her body was found, and then inexplicably returned to the store parking lot.
If I would have matched only 1 tire, that would have been a lot broader conclusion. But where you have 3 different tire designs on a vehicle and all 3 are present at the scene, that makes it a lot more substantial of a conclusion.
Detective Matthews and his colleagues now needed to find out why Natalie's car had been returned to the parking lot.
Give me a light.
The idea that the killer would take her, go somewhere, come back and leave the car where he took it from really didn't make much sense. And so that was one of the big things that we just thought just doesn't make sense, and let's see how we can show what really happened.
That would be a challenge. Not only did the crime lack logic, it had no motive and not one suspect.
The biggest challenges we had was, we were trying to prove a negative in a lot of ways. They're trying to say that an unknown stranger came and did this, and basically that's saying the whole world is a suspect.
In a case like this, the job is not to find suspects, but to eliminate them. Detective Ainsworth continued scrutinizing the victim's husband, Matthew Mirabal. Matthew gave authorities permission to search the Mirabal house. Nothing seemed particularly noteworthy or suspicious, until they found a recently executed life insurance policy. It provided $250,000 to Matthew Mirabal in the event of his wife's death. The policy wasn't so unusual, except detectives found it in a briefcase stashed beneath the living room sofa. Police believed they found the first clue to Natalie's murder, a potential motive. Natalie Mirabal was dead, and Colorado investigators tried to eliminate her husband, Matthew, from the suspects list, until they hit a snag. A $250,000 life insurance policy on Natalie, issued only a few months earlier, seemed generous and a little too timely. Detective Steve Ainsworth found out something else about the policy. Matthew had purchased it in secret.
He had paid with a money order from a nearby grocery store when he would write $2.79 checks or $1.50 checks. He wrote checks for everything, but he went to this grocery store and took the trouble of getting a money order for this particular life insurance policy rather than writing a check that his wife would have seen.
Green chair over there.
The insurance provided a potential motive,
Thank you for
and
coming
it
in.
steered the investigation toward Matthew
I
Mirabal.
just wanted to ask you some questions here. First of all, he tried to get $1 million on her. But he told the agent that if anything ever happened to my wife, I want to be able to stay home and take care of my baby, which is kind of unusual. Also, the amount that he was asking for, in that she didn't have an income because she was a stay-at-home mom. He didn't have an income anywhere near that kind of money. And so when it was dropped down to $250,000 and he just immediately accepted it without argument or anything, that was a little suspicious also.
There's no problem. Thank you.
Detective Ainsworth went to the painting company where he worked to ask him some questions. But Mirabal and the other workers were out on jobs. Ainsworth took the opportunity to look around. He was careful to limit his search to outdoor public areas. He never went inside. Not knowing what exactly he was searching for, he checked the trash cans. He noticed a plastic shopping bag.
I pulled it out and I looked in it, and there was this flashlight packaging with the flashlight gone, the batteries gone. There's also a cardboard tab for a pair of cotton jersey gloves. And why I took it, I can't tell you. It's just, I don't know if it didn't go with the rest of the trash or why, but so I took it.
The items were sent to the crime lab, where technicians raised a fingerprint from the plastic bag. The police didn't have Matthew Mirabal's fingerprints on file to compare it against. They needed to collect more evidence.
Oh, looks like the same wood that was
They impounded his truck, where Detective Tony Matthews found a more significant clue, one that might link Mirabal to the crime scene.
In the back of his truck was a piece of redwood, and this piece of redwood is very similar in appearance to the piece from the scene. I thought at the time, I wonder if this matches that broken off piece.
piece of redwood.
The wood and other items were tagged and collected.
There's another piece of redwood.
Though the redwood was similar to the piece found at the crime scene, the two sections did not fit together, suggesting that a third piece was still out there, waiting to be found. Other clues also needed to be pursued.
I'm not sure.
After seeing the flashlight packaging, one of the detectives remembered a similar flashlight he saw during the search of Mirabal's home.
Take a look at them, see what we got here.
They returned to the Mirabal house to collect it.
Thank you very much. I'm done. Can you tell us away from the group?
Swabs of the flashlight tested positive for human blood, and its DNA was analyzed. Other investigators continued to comb the crime scene in ever-widening circles. They looked for the knife used to decapitate the victim, or any other obvious clue. It paid off. What they found was another shattered section of redwood.
It was about an 8-inch piece, and I looked at it and it had the knot on one end, which I could tell this is going to match the other one.
The three segments, two from the crime scene, one from Mirabal's truck, went to the crime lab for comparison. The case was literally beginning to come together.
Sure enough, you could just put them together like three pieces of a puzzle.
Though investigators couldn't build a solid case from broken lumber, the match further implicated Matthew Mirabal in the murder of his wife, Natalie.
That looks good.
Joe Clayton of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation examined the gloves found in Natalie's car. His expertise is serology, the study of blood and bodily fluids. Swabs revealed the stains were human blood. But that wasn't all.
One of those had an obvious cut along one of the seams in the thumb area. By turning the glove inside out, I noticed that there was blood on the inside. The blood on the outside did not look like it had soaked through. It was not that thick of a stain. So I not only collected blood from the outside, I collected blood from the seam on the inside.
The samples from both sides of the glove were analyzed for DNA. The DNA on the outside was consistent with Natalie Mirabal's. The DNA on the inside was not. Investigators concluded it belonged to her killer. Detectives knew Mirabal had a similar cut on his finger, and now they believed the slashed, bloody glove had put the solution to the crime within their reach. Matthew Mirabal was brought in for DNA testing and fingerprinting.
Mr. Mirabal, I really appreciate you coming down here.
The conclusive results came back from the lab. The blood on the inside of the glove was Matthew Mirabal's. His DNA was also found on the flashlight, along with DNA consistent with Natalie's. The prints lifted from the plastic bag found at his workplace also belonged to him. Detective Ainsworth concluded he'd purchased the flashlight and the gloves for the sole purpose of murdering his wife.
And that indicates that this isn't a heat of passion thing where he just got angry and it was a substantial heat of passion where he just killed her on a spur of the moment kind of a thing. This indicated that he had planned it for a day or two.
Investigators theorized that shortly after arriving home from the street fair, Matthew and Natalie Mirabal and their infant daughter left on an errand. Matthew managed to get Natalie to an unknown location where he killed her with the redwood board, hoping to collect the insurance money. After taking her body to the canyon and decapitating her, he drove to the supermarket, left her car there, and walked home with the baby. By decapitating her, Mirabal believed he'd throw suspicion off of himself, hoping police would think Natalie's murder was linked to the other beheadings in the area. He was wrong.
During the course of the investigation and the prosecution, you get to know the victim's family very well. We got to know all of Natalie's extended family and got very close to them. And so by the end of the investigation, it's not just the injustice that you're trying to correct, but it's an entire family that you're trying to support and work for. And you don't want to let them down.
Everybody that was involved in that case did such a great job. It was amazing. Now I realize sometimes people put the system down, but they don't realize how hard it is and how much work it is, you know. And people say the system doesn't work. The system works.
For his crime, Matthew Mirabal was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Natalie Mirabal's grim fate was known within hours of her disappearance. In other abductions, the victim's fate remains an agonizing mystery. The outlying areas of Duluth, Minnesota are a haven for fishermen and hunters. In 1999, one hunter preyed on young women. In the early hours of May 27th, the Carlton County Police dispatcher received a call. A clerk was missing from a secluded convenience store. No one, including her family, had heard from her since the previous evening. Police arrived and spoke to the owner, who discovered the store unattended. He told police the clerk, Katie Poyer, was very responsible and would never leave the store, even for a minute. Cash was still in the register. Whatever happened here didn't involve robbery. Moose Lake and Carlton County officers checked the area outside the store. But but found nothing suspicious or out of place. And absolutely no sign of Katie. The store was equipped with surveillance cameras. Whatever happened was likely captured on tape. The police notified the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. The Bureau helps rural police departments solve serious crimes. The agents were eager to view the tapes.
Now, has their parents been talked to?
They discovered the images were fuzzy, but the implications were clear. 19-year-old Katie Poyer had been abducted. In Carlton County, Minnesota, store security footage gave authorities a clue to the fate of Katie Poyer. As the grainy scene played out over 4 horrifying minutes, it provided BCA Special Agent Phil Wagner with an extraordinary but inadequate perspective on the crime.
It gave us a rare piece of evidence. We were actually able to see the crime in progress. It told us where this crime happened. It told us when it happened. It showed clearly the victim. The only thing it didn't tell us was who did it.
Whoever he was, investigators needed to find him right away. A young woman's life likely depended on it. But Sheriff David Sebo had only the barest description to go on.
The surveillance tape that we looked at told us that we were dealing with a white male, an approximate age range, an approximate height range, and also a method of how he went about abducting Katie Poyer.
The kidnapper's face remained indistinct. The situation frustrated investigators. Here was photographic evidence of a crime in progress, foiled by the limitations of the video cameras. And the motive for the crime was equally unclear. Authorities knew they had to launch a wide-scale search, and they had to do it now.
We know that the clock is running on any victim that's taken, as far as their safety goes.
The Minnesota National Guard joined the Carlton County Police Department, the Moose Lake Sheriff's Office, and throngs of volunteers in the search for Katie Poyer.
Everybody loves Katie.
Police spoke to the victim's mother to see if perhaps Katie mentioned being stalked or followed, or if she was having trouble with anyone. Her mother couldn't think of any problems her daughter might have had. In fact, it was a happy time. Katie had just moved in with her fiancé and was excited about her new apartment. She had many friends and was working her way through college. She was also considering becoming a police officer.
Thank you. You're welcome. Because now you've got a cook in your own house. She has many.
Mrs. Poyer urged the police to find her daughter.
Okay, ma'am. Good day.
They assured her they would do everything in their power to bring Katie home. In the days that followed, hundreds of law enforcement personnel and volunteers were brought in to aid in the search. But as the search went on, investigators' hopes of finding Katie alive were dwindling. Then, a canvass of the shops near the convenience store uncovered a potential witness. A clerk at a sandwich shop recalled seeing a man shortly before the abduction who acted strangely. She said he was staring at her and appeared to be lurking in the parking lot. The clerk kept her eye on him and was concerned enough to jot a partial license number from his black truck. BCA Special Agent Terry Smith.
As we canvassed the area, one of the common themes that we heard over and over was about a person with a black truck. We had a description that seemed to fit from a number of different people. And sometimes they were a little bit vague in what it was about him, but they all were troubled by the way he looked at women or the way that he seemed to behave.
From witness descriptions, investigators managed to put together a rough sketch. The information gathered from the witnesses suggested that Katie was in the hands of a sexual predator.
Well, what happened in the other 6 cases?
Authorities held a press conference to enlist the public's help. If Katie was still in the area, perhaps someone had seen her or would recognize the sketch of her kidnapper.
I do not want to discuss some.
While the drawing circulated, Carlton County Sheriff David Sebo followed up on the black truck seen the night of the abduction.
We had received information of the partial license plate, and we entered that into the computer along with a description of the vehicle, and from that generated about 2,000 registered owners of vehicles in Minnesota.
The 2,000 names was a daunting list of potential suspects. No lead was left unchecked. The sheriff's office alerted officers to be on the lookout for any vehicles matching the truck's description and tags. Police made contact with everyone who had a similar license plate number. Donald Pintz was on that list. Pintz wasn't home. His wife acknowledged they owned a truck, but it was gray, not black. When asked about her husband's whereabouts on the evening of May 26th, she said he'd been fishing at their lake property, but had returned home around 8 p.m. He remained there for the rest of the night. Like many of their leads, this one went nowhere. Authorities returned to the tape, seeking some overlooked clue. They took it to video analyst Lance Parthay to see if he could clear up the image. Parthay wasn't optimistic.
When somebody contacts us and says, I'd like you to look at our surveillance tape, instantly you know there's problems because the quality of the cameras, number one, usually they're inexpensive because the surveillance systems that are put into these convenience stores are not necessarily put in to catch criminals. They're basically to monitor their facility to keep the employees honest. So the quality of the video is usually going to be poor.
With little to work with, Parthay did his best to enhance the video. Finessing the images from that camera, they determined the suspect wore a New York baseball jersey.
And there was some conversation about the number. Was it number 22? Was it number 23? And without being able to say 100% it was number 23, after looking at the tape and enhancing the contrast, we determined that the number 23 was more likely than the number 22.
This new bit of information needed to be public.
I'm Paul Molitor.
Authorities appealed to Minnesota Twins player Paul Molitor to make a public service announcement.
A young woman from Moose Lake, Minnesota. She's been missing since May 26, 1999.
They hoped his on-air plea might reach sports fans who recognized the suspicious character with this type of jersey.
This model of jersey is well.
Carlton County Police were inundated with calls. The public service announcement brought in over 1,800 new leads. Some of the callers even reported to have seen Katie. But none of the leads led to Katie, and hope she was still alive faded. As authorities narrowed down the leads, one man, a convicted sex offender named Samuel Becker, resembled the sketch. Becker denied any involvement or knowledge of Katie Poyer's abduction. Investigators noticed the large tattoo on his forearm and needed to find out whether the suspect on the videotape had similar markings. He agreed to cooperate with authorities and allow himself to be taped by the store's security cameras. When still photographs from both tapes were evaluated, authorities noticed tattoos on Becker's arm were clearly visible. Katie's kidnapper had no visible tattoos. Samuel Becker was not their man. BCA Special Agent Terry Smith and his team hit many dead ends as they eliminated suspects.
There were several people who became strong suspects for a period of time in the case. Sometimes they started out looking very, very good for the crime, and then we would either be able to establish that they couldn't have done it, or it didn't look like they had done it, and somebody else would become the preeminent suspect.
A man phoned authorities to say his co-worker, Donald Turner, wore a blue and white number 23 baseball jersey. He used to wear his hair long, but recently cut it short. Turner also drove a black truck. A check on Donald Turner revealed police already knew him, but by a more familiar name, Donald Pintz. They had interviewed his wife early in the investigation. They needed to find Pintz, and they needed to find him fast.
Is that Donald?
Investigators quickly tracked him down, never letting him out of their sight. They rushed to secure search warrants for his home and lake property.
Let me make a note.
The investigation now focused entirely on Donald Pintz. Donald Pintz was now under round-the-clock surveillance. Police believed he was the one responsible for the abduction of 19-year-old Katie Poyer from a convenience store in Moose Lake, Minnesota. Armed with the search warrants, detectives returned to Pintz's house. No one was home. But in the garage, they found a black truck. Its license plate matched the partial description given by the sandwich shop clerk. Police had the vehicle towed to the BCA crime lab. A forensic examination with a Lumalight looked for traces of blood. None was found inside or outside the truck. But it was evident that it had been recently and thoroughly cleaned. A clean black truck isn't necessarily suspicious, but police wondered why his wife said it was gray. Next, investigators searched Pintz's lakeside property, eventually focusing on the fire pit, where they screened the cold ashes. And that's when they found a tooth, along with fragments of bone. They carefully collected the frail remains. At Hamlin University in Minnesota, anthropologist Susan Thurston Meister delicately sorted the fragments. Her first assignment, to determine if they were animal or human.
There are two ways of determining the difference between human bones and animal bones. The first is using your naked eye and just looking at the shape and the contours and the texture of the bone and where the muscle attachment areas are. The second way is to look at the microscopic structures. In humans, the microscopic structures are very chaotically organized. They impinge on one another, they bump up against one another, and in animals, non-human animals, they are arranged in parallel rows.
The bones had come from a human. And from the pattern of chips and cracks on the surface, she determined the victim was incinerated shortly after death. After piecing together the larger bones, she had more information to share about the victim.
I was able to determine that the individual was female, of slight stature and build, and also that she was between the ages of 19 and 24 years of age.
The bones revealed key clues. The victim resembled Katie Poyer. But a fundamental question lingered. Were these actually Katie's remains? The focus shifted to the tooth retrieved from the fire pit. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension sent it to forensic odontologist Thomas Rumreich for analysis.
The tooth was tested for DNA. However, the tooth was so badly burned that any DNA evidence had been destroyed by the intense heat of the fire.
Dr. Rumreich needed to find another way to match this tooth with the victim. From its shape, and by reconstructing some of the jaw fragments, he determined the position of the molar in the victim's mouth. By coincidence, Katie Poyer had had the filling of that tooth replaced 2 weeks before her abduction. The burned tooth's filling had melted out during the fire. Because filling materials vary, Dr. Rumreich had the remains analyzed.
Because we had discovered that there was some evidence of metal fragments in the burned remains, we had those analyzed by the metallurgical folks at the BCA to determine if any of the components of that metal fragment corresponded with what we commonly use in filling material today.
Most silver fillings are made of a combination of metals called amalgam. Katie's dentist had also used a new dental adhesive to help the amalgam stay in the tooth. Analyzing the tooth from the fire pit, BCA forensic scientist Donald Melander made a compelling discovery. Traces of that same adhesive.
Since this is a new product, one would not expect to see it. The product had only been on the market for 6 months. And in fact, the dentist was using a sample that had been supplied to her at a dental show. So it's quite unique.
Investigators had gathered ample evidence against Donald Pintz. The dental adhesive gave them enough to pick him up. Authorities moved in for the arrest.
Driver, hands out the window. Step out the car. Do it now. Stay there. Don't move.
Confronted with the evidence, Pintz confessed.
Put her on the...
But later, he recanted his story and denied any knowledge of Katie Poyer. It was to no avail. The forensic evidence against him was overwhelming.
You recall taking the girl.
Authorities believe Pintz waited until Katie was alone in the store. Somehow, he lured her away from the register, got her to the back of the shop, and overpowered her. Then he led her out of the store and ultimately to her death. He disposed of her body in the fire pit at his lakeside property. But he failed to dispose of it completely. Donald Pintz was sentenced to life without parole. More than any other kind of case, solving an abduction is truly a race against time. And even though the clock sometimes runs out, the race to justice continues to the end. In the Florida Panhandle, a young passerby discovers a killer's dumping ground. A metal chain may be a link to a victim's final hours. But investigators must first confirm the identity from the charred bones if they ever hope to solve the brutal crime.
Jackie!
An idyllic backyard in rural Tennessee becomes the backdrop for the unthinkable.
Jackie!
A little girl disappears in broad daylight.
Tell me which one.
With every passing hour, police lose hope of ever seeing her alive.
This one?
But before detectives can prove murder, they must find her body. Some killers choose to hide their victims. And investigators must then rely on forensic examiners to uncover proof of murder. These are just 2 extraordinary crimes that have made their way into the medical examiner's casebook. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The Gulf Coast of the Florida Panhandle is known for its quiet beaches and peaceful living. But on March 4th, 1999, Okaloosa County's tranquil lifestyle was threatened. That afternoon, investigator Stan Griggs of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office was called to an isolated wooded area. Children discovered a body while playing in the woods. Panicked, a young mother phoned police. In his 15 years with the department, Griggs had never seen anything like it.
There was a charred body that was secured to a tree with chains and rope. We actually could not tell definitively if it was male or female.
The investigators scoured the scene for clues, looking for anything that would tell them who this person was and why he or she died so violently. Although the crime scene was littered with debris, physical clues were scarce.
There wasn't a lot of evidence around the body. A few cans, a roll of duct tape, a couple items of clothing. We didn't find anything that would lead toward the identification of the victim, much less any perpetrators.
The victim's hands were bound with a blood-stained cord, and duct tape was stretched across what remained of the skull. Fragmented bones and tattered clothing were charred beyond recognition. It appeared the victim had been dead for quite some time.
There was insect activity, an insect activity that indicated that whoever perpetrated this made more than one visit.
The body showed evidence of maggots, a process that normally takes 2 weeks. But the finding posed more questions than it answered. The insects were burned just like the body. Forensic specialist Jan Johnson took samples.
It was a puzzle. We couldn't figure out why someone would come back, obviously, a couple of weeks after the person had died, to burn the body.
Dr. Michael Birkland, Chief Deputy Medical Examiner for the district, carefully prepared to recover the remains.
We were very intent on getting the body removed exactly the way it was pretty much positioned at the scene because of an injury that I identified to the neck region. That was going to be very important to keep the neck in that position until we got back and were able to x-ray.
The remains were taken to the morgue for autopsy. Evidence collected at the scene was transferred to the Forensic Science Unit at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. None of the items found at the crime scene produced anything concrete. Authorities were no closer to identifying the victim or the killer. After examination, it was determined the victim was an adult male, less than 6 feet tall. Establishing cause of death would fall to Dr. Michael Birkland.
When we got the body back, we went ahead and did x-rays looking for any projectiles or foreign bodies, and we did not see any evidence that this represented either a gunshot wound case, or there were no foreign knife tips or anything like that left in the body. The x-rays showed a number of fractures to the body of the upper extremities, what we call defense injuries, where the arms had been put up to try to ward off blows. There were a number of skull fractures that caused extensive fracturing of the base of the skull.
Dr. Birkland believed the victim was killed by a blunt force trauma to the neck. The autopsy report documented a brutal murder, and it also helped establish a sequence of events.
If you're transporting a dead body to what we would consider a secondary dump site, there's no need to bind it, gag it, and chain it to a tree. So It was common sense that told us that the body was probably transported there initially live, may have already indeed been injured because this was a fairly stocky person, and so without subduing him somehow, I would have thought you would have put up a considerable fight. And certainly you would not have to chain a dead person to the tree.
But Dr. Brooklyn was still puzzled by the insects. There were several populations of maggots present in the body. He concluded from their numbers and their size that the victim had been dead about a month.
The most startling revelation was that there was charred maggots, indicating that the maggots had been there for a while, grown up a little bit, and then somebody came back and set the fire. For the investigation, that meant that whoever had brought the body there had came back to the scene again.
Fingerprinting the victim was difficult. His hands had been damaged by fire. But there was enough soft tissue on the right thumb to make an impression.
Given that one of his fingers was not badly involved in the charring process, we were able to find enough minutia and ridge detail. So we were able to have sufficient information from that one finger to attempt a match.
While the prints were sent for comparison to the Florida Crime Lab, investigator Griggs was determined to learn the identity of the victim. The autopsy established the victim died sometime around the 1st of February. Investigator Griggs began checking missing persons reports.
We send out a bulletin over the law enforcement net that we have found the body and asking for any kind of missing persons information other agencies may have.
One stood out as a strong possibility. A local restaurant worker was reported missing on February 13, 1999.
Okay, get right on. Thanks, sir.
Cordell Richards was a 32-year-old male of Asian descent. The last time anyone saw him was around the 3rd.
We checked with the Fort Walton Beach Police Department, and they told us a friend had reported Cordell Richards missing. They naturally went to the apartment to check on his welfare. There they found young people who claimed that they didn't know where he was.
I'm alright, how are you?
Oh, pretty good. I'm looking for Cordell. Does he live there?
A young student named Crystal Maestas rented a room from Cordell. 17-year-old Ron Bell was her boyfriend. The two teenagers confirmed Cordell left in early February, but they didn't know why.
Okay. Is there anybody else in the house?
Just us two now.
You mind if I take a look?
Good.
Sir, could you have a seat over there?
Ron Bell and Crystal Maestas stuck with a story that Cordell Richards just disappeared after receiving some unknown type of court papers. He piled up some black bags in the apartment, and the next day he was gone along with the black bags. They never saw him again.
What's your first name?
Crystal.
Crystal, could you do me a favor?
The teenager's story seemed suspicious.
Give me a call and let me know.
Sure.
Okay, here's my card. All my information's on the card. Okay.
Detective Griggs decided to interview the friend that reported Cordell Richards missing.
Just have a seat right there. I understand that you're the one that reported Cordell Richards missing.
Yes, correct.
Okay, you're a friend of his?
Yeah, we've known each other for about a year and a half.
Okay.
According to his friend, Cordell Richards was a good man.
So, Grandpa, you look like you're good enough to go play some golf later, huh?
He was especially close to his grandparents, spending a lot of time with them since his grandfather had fallen ill. Cordell was divorced with 2 small children.
Thank you so much.
He worked at 2 jobs in order to support his family.
Everybody I talked to about Cordell Richards told me what a responsible person he was, a hard-working person. He worked several jobs, and his bosses always considered him highly reliable.
Investigators finally believed they were about to put a name on the victim that had remained anonymous for all these weeks. The name was Cordell Richards. In Okaloosa County, Florida, investigators struggled to identify a body that was not much more than a skeleton. The victim was badly burned and chained to a tree. After checking missing persons reports, the sheriff's department uncovered a possible match. Forensic specialist Jan Johnson worked to identify the body using a single thumbprint.
This body was extremely decomposed and burned, and I was very shocked to find that there was still enough friction-rich detail to affect an identification. The fingerprints did match the fingerprints of the unidentified deceased, which was the skeletal remains of Cordell Richards. Investigator Griggs,
Fingerprints confirmed it. Cordell Richards was no longer a missing person. He was a murder victim.
That is correct.
Investigators returned to the Fort Walton Beach apartment complex where Cordell Richards had lived.
How you doing?
Hi.
Stan Griggs with the Sheriff's Office. Can we speak to you for a minute?
Sure.
Can we come on in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Crystal Maestas answered the door.
What's going on?
I need to ask you a few questions about Cordell Richards.
Yeah, I rent a room for me.
You do? Which room?
The one right there.
Okay.
Forensic specialist Jan Johnson analyzed the apartment.
Okay, we have a search warrant for this apartment. Okay, because we're trying to locate Mr. Richards. Okay? Here, why don't you look it over?
Okay,
And if you want to step outside, yes, ma'am. It was sparse, but there were some items left behind that, to me, the average person wouldn't leave behind. I knew Cordell Richards exclusively rode a bicycle. He didn't drive. A bicycle was there.
It was a small but important clue. Griggs wondered if Cordell was taken from his apartment by force.
A visual examination did not detect any blood evidence, so we decided to use luminol. Luminol is a presumptive test which is used on trace amounts of blood or blood that's been cleaned up. We sprayed the apartment, and there were 8 areas that did give a positive reaction for blood. We've got a medium velocity spatter pattern here, it looks like. Also a couple of transfer stains. Looks like partial hand impressions. After I documented the blood spatter, I then swabbed those areas, and those swabbings were sent to our laboratory for DNA analysis, and the blood came back as being conclusive as that of Cordell Richards.
Back in the lab, Johnson tested her theory of how the spatter got onto the wall. Using blood-soaked sponges and paper targets, she reproduced medium velocity spatter.
Medium velocity spatter is 1 millimeter to 3 millimeters in diameter and normally is associated with forceful impacts from blunt force trauma.
Okay, thank you.
They now had proof Cordell Richards was brutally beaten in his apartment.
Hey guys.
But in order to find his killer, they needed to find out why.
Have you heard of any robberies, home invasions, or burglaries.
Detectives checked for reported break-ins in the area.
I haven't heard anything like that.
There weren't any. In fact, in recent years, there were very few robberies in the neighborhood.
Okay, thanks. I didn't know why Cordell Richards was killed. We were looking at possible gambling debts, possible debts like he may have owed. That was a possibility. It didn't seem like it was broken in as a haphazard thing.
For a second.
Yeah.
Investigators canvassed the neighborhood near where the body was found.
Do you remember anything?
One woman recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked near the woods about a month before.
Right.
And I noticed two teenagers coming from those woods over there.
Okay.
And
It was a gray hatchback. It had a missing window.
like a compact car, and one of the rear windows was punched out and was broken because there was a black trash bag covering it.
Okay.
The next day, investigators found Ronald Bell and Crystal Maestas as they were about to enter a gray car, matching the witness's description.
This your vehicle?
Yes, sir.
It is? Yes.
Bell confirmed the car belonged to him.
You know Cordell Richards?
Yes, I met him a few times and I've come to pick her up.
Do you know Cordell Richards, man?
Yeah, I rent a room from him.
Okay. What happened to your window on the vehicle?
Had a burglary a couple of weeks ago.
Evidence was mounting. Both teenagers knew Cordell Richards. Bell's car was spotted near the crime scene, and the victim's blood was found on the walls of the apartment Crystal shared with him.
I don't know where it's at.
It was enough to obtain a warrant to search the car. The car was searched and dusted for fingerprints. But no evidence was found connecting the vehicle to the victim. Next, investigators questioned officials at the school Ron Bell attended.
That you already saw in there?
I did note that he was gone from the 2nd to the 5th straight, and then quite a
He
few
was
days
absent several days in early February.
an unusual pattern for him.
Is it?
Come on in.
Ted Mazzo, a fellow student, confirmed Ronald Bell borrowed his truck twice during that time.
Let's see, you don't mind any answering any questions or anything I have today?
No, sir.
But Mazzo was not the only person to have information on Bell.
So, what can you tell me about Cordell Richards? He told us that Ron Bell asked him to decipher the password on a computer. He described the computer to me. He also described the layout of the interior of Cordell Richards' apartment.
How hard can it be?
Ron and Crystal were trying to log onto the internet, but they couldn't get past the password.
You're useless, Michael.
They asked Paul Martin to hack in.
Can't you get a ride home or something?
Try something else.
Yeah, you gotta help us with some bags.
Just keep working on that until we get there.
Paul noticed that all the files on the computer belonged to someone named Cordell.
Leave it alone, man. It's not gonna work.
Mike, it's not gonna work. Let's go.
He also said that Ron Bell disposed of some property from the apartment and some dumpsters. We searched dumpsters up and down the area, didn't find anything. Of course, by this time it'd been a couple months. We just had hopes that maybe something may have fallen out to the side. We did have some fortune where Cordell Richards' identification card was found near a dumpster by some telephone workers.
Although there was a wealth of circumstantial evidence, it wasn't enough.
Hey, Stan.
Yeah. Can you hang on 1 second? Okay, thank you.
I gotta leave.
Without a witness to tie it all together, they couldn't make a case.
Anybody that won't talk to anybody but us.
Okay, be right there. Hey, can I call you right back? Okay, thank you.
On March 17th, investigator Griggs received a startling message. someone wanted to talk about the murder anonymously. "32-year-old Cordell Richards had been brutally murdered. His body was so badly burned, the medical examiner had trouble establishing the cause of death.
Thank you.
Just as it seemed the case would go cold, investigator Stan Griggs of the Okaloosa Sheriff's Department received a call. The caller was young and terrified. He said he had information about the case. But he only agreed to talk to investigators anonymously. The informant claimed Renee Lynx, a friend of Crystal's, was bragging about the murder.
He told us that Renee Lynx told him that she, Ron Bell, and Crystal Maestas were going to kill a guy because the guy had made advances on Crystal. She and Crystal were going to seduce him. Ron Bell would hit him over the head, knock him out, and they would dispose of his body.
It was a chilling story. Renee Lynx was called into the sheriff's department for questioning. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Renee Lynx admitted she helped Ronald Bell and Crystal Maestas abduct Cordell Richards and chain him to a tree in the woods.
Tie his hands and being kind of...
Despite beating and burning him, Cordell Richards was still alive. They purchased a meat cleaver at a discount store to finish him off.
All right, if you could, just go ahead and stand up, place your hands behind your back, because you're going to be arrested for murder.
Renee Lynx was only 15 years old when she was arrested for murder. Crystal Maestas and her boyfriend, Ronald Bell, were also arrested. Their fate hung on whether or not investigator Griggs could prove they purchased a meat cleaver at a discount store, as Renee Lynx had alleged.
This store has better than average surveillance cameras. We've got video of Ron Bell, Crystal Maestas, and Renee Lynx not only buying the cleaver, but returning it for a refund.
That's exactly what I need. I'm gonna have to take that from you.
When you see their faces on the video, this was not a bad happenstance that got out of hand. They're laughing on the video.
Is that the original tape?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is there any possible way you can trace the new owner of the meat cleaver?
I have to check the bar.
They had records of where 3 cleavers had been returned. One was purchased by a credit card. They checked the inventory numbers and confirmed that that was the cleaver that was in question, the one that was used.
Yeah, that one right there, that one.
Investigators retrieved the meat cleaver as evidence.
Just get it out of here.
You sure you haven't used it?
In the lab, Jan Johnson analyzed the blade for blood. Ultimately, no blood stains were found. They would have to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to convict the 3 teenagers who purchased the cleaver.
Crystal Maestas gave a very condensed version of the murder of Cordell Richards.
Crystal didn't always get along with her landlord.
Are you guys deaf or something? I can't even hear myself think in there.
Come join us, we saved your seat.
But she also knew Cordell was attracted to her. This made her boyfriend, Ronald Bell, very angry.
Is that seat for me?
He decided to do something about it. He knocked Cordell unconscious with a blunt object.
He was rolled up in a blanket, taken to a place in the western part of our county. He revived. They secured him to a tree. They began beating him with a baseball bat. They take turns hitting him on various parts of his body. He's still moaning. He's unconscious, but he's moaning. And he's starting to revive again. And it's then Ron Bell pulls out some cigarette lighter fluid, soaks Cordell Richards with it, and lights him on fire. And they come back the next day. Cordell Richards is still alive. He's moaning for help. They go to a nearby department store, buy a meat cleaver, go out there, and they finish him off. I think the whole community was horrified that essentially children this age committed such a crime.
Crystal Maestas was tried and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ronald Bell is also serving a life sentence for his role in the murder. They were both tried as adults. Florida investigators combined science and determination to convict killers who were barely old enough to drive. But in Tennessee, when a child is the victim, a whole community comes together to track down a human predator. Montgomery County, Tennessee is located just 40 miles outside of Nashville. It's a place where life is simple and people feel safe.
Jackie! Jackie!
But on the afternoon of July 8, 1996, Jeannie Meyer learned the meaning of fear.
Jackie!
She was running late. Her son had a dental appointment, and her daughter Jackie was in the backyard picking blackberries.
Jackie! Jackie!
Jeannie's annoyance quickly turned to panic. Her daughter was only 9 years old, and now she was missing.
Jackie!
Can you describe her to me?
She's 9 years old. She had a pink shirt on, and she had her favorite
The Montgomery County Sheriff's Department responded.
Okay, I have a picture
Jackie
of her.
Beard was 4'7", with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes.
Okay.
She was wearing a pink shirt and jeans.
50 pounds. I don't.
Jeannie tried to think of anything unusual that happened lately.
I have some other ones, but that's really.
She recalled seeing a stranger in the neighborhood.
Hey, good kick.
He was talking to Jackie and her friends.
Around here in the woods or in your playground? Hey, little girl. When you're playing around here, if you just look on the ground and if you see something, you know, about 6 keys on a ring. Oh, yes, ma'am.
The man identified himself as Tommy Robertson, an undercover police officer.
And I lost my keys out here.
He said he'd lost his keys somewhere in the neighborhood.
To see if I could find them, and I saw you.
He wondered if the children had seen them.
If they had seen them around anywhere.
So your name is what again?
Yeah, it's Tommy, ma'am. Tommy Robertson. And I appreciate it if y'all see my keys around here anywhere, just call the police department.
Okay.
All right? Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate
Have a
it.
good day.
Okay.
They're her favorite shoes. They're her absolute
The Montgomery
favorite.
County police officer reassured Jeannie, more often than not, missing children come home.
We've got several officers right now.
In the meantime, they would do everything they could to find little Jackie.
All right, then we're going to keep this.
After a quick search of personnel records, investigator Billy Batson discovered there was no Tommy Robertson on the force. The optimism police felt now turned to concern, and every available officer was called in to find the missing girl.
Jackie! Jackie!
In Montgomery Montgomery County, Tennessee, 9-year-old Jackie Beard was picking blackberries in her backyard.
Jackie!
10 minutes later, she disappeared.
Jackie!
Along with police, Montgomery County Rescue Squad coordinated the massive search effort, dispatching the K-9 unit and community volunteers. They combed the woods, searching for any sign of the missing girl. Billy Batson, an investigator with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, tried to remain optimistic.
It's a missing child at this point. We have initiated ground searches, including dogs and people who have volunteered to search the area looking for Jackie. Certainly our hopes were high that we would find her and that she would be safe and close to home.
Using the Myers house as their starting point, investigators fanned out. They searched the woods for hours. And with each passing hour, it seemed more likely that Jackie had been abducted. Children from the neighborhood were called into the sheriff's department and asked about the man posing as a police officer.
Can you look at these here and tell me which one looked close to you?
They gave descriptions of the stranger who called himself Tommy Robertson.
That one will work. This one? Let's capture that.
Feature by feature, a composite photo slowly emerged. In Jackie's neighborhood, the ground search intensified. There was no sign of the child or of the man police now suspected of abducting her. Police went door to door, hoping someone would provide them with any information regarding the little girl's whereabouts.
Hi, yes.
How you doing? I'm Detective Shock. This is Officer Wood.
But nothing turned up.
We understand.
Investigators hoped media attention would bring them closer to finding Jackie and the stranger who police believed had taken her from her own backyard.
The next day, after this information had been in the newspaper, we started receiving several phone calls about an individual named Glenn Rogers who matched the description that was given in the paper, and that these people were concerned that he at least needed to be checked out.
Investigator Batson ran a background check. William Glenn Rogers had a long list of felony convictions. Police were dispatched to bring Rogers in for questioning. Rogers claimed that although he was in the Myers neighborhood the day Jackie disappeared, he never saw her. He was only looking for his keys.
Yes.
Police didn't believe him, and the results of a polygraph examination confirmed their suspicions.
No.
It indicated he was lying.
I've been out of work a long time.
Then he came up with a much different story.
Job that day.
He said when he couldn't find his keys, he returned to his car. As he put the car in reverse, he felt a bump, as if he'd hit a tree. Instead, he said he accidentally ran over a little girl, killing her instantly. Rogers panicked. He knew his record would make the accident seem suspicious.
He didn't know what to do. He got in the car and drove. He came to a bridge which goes over the Cumberland River, not far from that scene, and he got out of the car, went to the passenger side, got Jackie from the car, and threw her over the side of the bridge into the Cumberland River.
Batson, along with Special Agent Brett Murray of the FBI, were more than a little skeptical.
The interview right after the polygraph test, I did not believe. I did believe the fact that he was responsible for her disappearance, which he basically said he was, but the facts surrounding how she disappeared were not something that we believed. We knew there was more to the story. The key then was to try to find Jackie.
Rogers was placed under arrest while investigators checked out his story. The Montgomery County Rescue Squad and surrounding county squads were dispatched to the Cumberland River. They searched for much-needed physical evidence if they hoped to disprove Rogers' story that Jackie's death was an accident.
Glenn Rogers has confessed that he was responsible for Jackie Beard's death, and he said in his statement that he took her body and threw it off the bridge, the Zinc Plant Road that crosses Cumberland River. And at this time we've initiated dragging operations. If in fact that's true, we hope to recover her body.
Despite an exhaustive search, investigators came away empty-handed. There was no sign of Jackie. Police headed back to their only hope, the one person who knew where to find her. That man was Glenn Rogers, and this time they were determined to get to the truth. In Tennessee, a 9-year-old girl had been missing for 3 days. William Glenn Rogers, a convicted felon, claimed he accidentally hit Jackie Beard with his car. He said he panicked, then dumped her body in a river. A search team dragged the Cumberland River, but there was no sign of Jackie Beard's body. Investigators suspected Rogers was lying.
Yeah, let me call you back.
They called his wife in for questioning.
Detective shot.
Hi, Mrs. Rogers.
She admitted that on the night of July 8th, her husband left the house for several hours.
That's correct. He was about 3 hours late, actually.
His wife remembered the incident because she was angry.
He was so late.
Rogers came home late that night.
Bill, do you know how late it is? Where have you
She noticed he had mud on his pants and a spot of blood on his shirt. The car was muddy too. Rogers made a vague excuse. He said he'd been walking through the woods.
She was waiting for the car to take her grandkids to a school function, so she remembered that. She also indicated that at some point she noticed some small smeared fingerprints on the passenger side of his car on the windshield.
Detective Batson was determined to find out how those tiny fingerprints got there and whether they proved Jackie Beard was still alive when Rogers put her in the car. For that, he needed a closer look at the suspect's car. A forensic team searched every inch of the vehicle. For an older car, it was suspiciously clean. Rogers had done a thorough job of detailing his car. So thorough, there wasn't a shred of evidence that Jackie Beard had ever been inside it.
If there's anything that you want to
Frustrated,
tell us about your
Batson
story,
questioned Rogers about the discrepancies between his statement and his wife's.
Well, now, you know, I've been thinking about this thing. Now, there is something I forgot about.
Rogers quickly changed his story to match hers. Without physical evidence or even a body, the sheriff's department couldn't prove him wrong. 4 months to the day, on November 8th, police in nearby Stewart County received a crucial call. A deer hunter reported seeing human skeletal remains at the Land Between the Lakes Wildlife and Recreation Area.
245 Bravo, 10-4.
The call was relayed to investigator Batson.
Can you give me a description? The agent in charge down there had heard about this case, and he called me and described to me the clothing that they had found down there, and I knew at that point that it was possibly Jackie.
Investigators and canine units converged on the national park, along with agents of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The combined team launched an intensive search to recover the remains. Investigators found a skull. Several strands of sandy blonde hair were still attached. Not far away, they discovered a clump of similar hair. Children's clothing was recovered and bagged as evidence. Dr. Murray Marks led a team of anthropologists from the University of Tennessee in a controlled search and recovery effort.
A crime scene, a forensic scene, is like an archaeological site. There's only one chance to excavate it. The crime scene was in a rural area, heavily wooded, though all the leaves were down. Many times that makes the recovery a little bit more difficult. We found elements scattered in a pretty wide area. And then we systematically go through looking at, for one thing, different layers of leaves. We can tell the seasonality. If the bones are on top of the leaves, obviously, that's happened after they fell. If they're under the leaf or under 2 or 3 layers of leaves, we know how many seasons have gone by. The skeletal remains were under 1 or 2 layers of leaves, so we knew some time had passed.
To learn more, Dr. Marks needed to analyze the skeletal remains. He returned to the forensic anthropology lab at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
We knew that we had a subadult individual. Prior to 20 years of age, you can look at dental development and the way the long bones grow and how long they are. So you can make an assessment of age relatively easy. Sex is difficult to ascertain prior to puberty. Prior to puberty, we cannot make an assessment of sex in skeletal remains. So we had no idea we were dealing with a female or a male.
The length of the long bones revealed that the victim was young, between the ages of 7 and 9.
271.
We're going to be interested.
Dr. Marks determined the remains were consistent with the little girls.
Pre-20 years, we're going to look at dental development.
The child had died 3 to 9 months ago, well within the time Jackie Beard disappeared.
We didn't see cut marks that are indicative of sharp force trauma. We didn't see bludgeoning or blunt force trauma, no fracture to bone. We didn't find the fragile bones in the neck that would tell us about strangulation. There was no evidence on the bone that told us anything about a cause or manner of death.
Now, investigators could only hope to make a positive identification.
We also did mitochondrial DNA, comparing the DNA of Jackie with her mother, and that was a match.
Identifying the remains was an important step. But Batson was missing the physical evidence needed to link William Glenn Rogers to the death of Jackie Beard. Once again, science provided answers.
When her clothing was collected, it was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for further analysis. When they examined the clothing, they found some fibers on Jackie's clothing that they really couldn't identify. Fibers of this type were also found in Glenn Rogers' car.
But they didn't match the car's carpet fibers. Forensic investigators went back to Rogers' house and collected fibers from his carpet. The carpet fibers matched those on Jackie's clothing. Rogers had tracked the fibers into his car. The match conclusively placed Jackie inside the suspect's car.
Did you find your keys?
Hey, little girl. Yeah,
Montgomery County investigators theorized that on July 8, 1996, Glenn Rogers lured 9-year-old Jackie into his car by posing as a trusted figure, a police officer. He then drove to a secluded spot where he raped and killed her. He later hid her body in a secluded area in Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. In January of 2000, William Glenn Rogers was convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of Jackie Beard. At his sentencing hearing, Jackie's mother spoke of her loss.
Jackie looked up to me more than anyone else, and I couldn't do the most important thing I would ever do in my life. I couldn't save her from a horrible situation. I cannot bring myself to imagine what she must have had to go through. My beautiful baby, scared, taken by force, molested, and then killed by a man she thought was a safe person.
William Glenn Rogers was sentenced to death. To cover their tracks, some killers go to great lengths to hide their vicious acts of violence. But in the end, most efforts fail. Forensic science can uncover the smallest clue, because even the most determined killer cannot commit the perfect crime. In the pre-dawn hours, a house catches fire in Wisconsin. Investigators determine that the blaze is a smokescreen designed to hide a more horrific act of violence. But the heat of the flames leaves the crime trail cold. In southern Florida, a series of fires becomes more than a coincidence. People are dying, and the community is frightened. Detectives must work quickly to calm fears and catch the killer before he strikes again. At a crime scene, everything is considered a potential clue. But a fire can destroy everything in its path, challenging forensic investigators at every turn and making each arson a trial by fire. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. "2:30 in the morning, November 25th, 1996. Most of La Crosse, Wisconsin slept. But one of its residents woke up to an alarming sight.
Your neighbor's house is on fire? What's the address there, please?
He noticed smoke pouring from his neighbor's house. Fire trucks raced to the scene, arriving moments later to find it consumed by flames. If anyone was home, firefighters feared they were trapped inside. La Crosse firefighter Dan Skiles knew he and his men had to get in quickly if they hoped to get anyone out alive. But there appeared to be no way in.
So instead of my normal routine of putting my shoulder into that door and pushing it open, I decided to sit down and use my legs to kick the door open.
Firefighter Skiles kicked open the door and discovered the floor of the kitchen completely destroyed by the fire. With no path to guide them, they relied on each other, making their way through the flames and looking for anyone who was trapped inside.
The person on the nozzle yelled out that he had a victim. We picked him up. I dragged him as far as I could before I ran out of air.
Despite their best efforts, firefighters pulled a man's lifeless body out of the burning rubble. It was the homeowner, 64-year-old Donald Harmasic. And firefighter Dan Skiles suspected something else was wrong.
There was blood on his head, and I thought that was unusual for a victim in a house fire to have any type of blood on him.
It was at that moment firefighters suspected they were dealing with something more than an accident. The body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives Dave Schatzley and Carrie Jaholski interviewed the neighbor who phoned police. And although he saw the flames, he said he did not see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Once the fire department declared the house safe for entry, fire investigators went to work. Deputy Fire Marshal Gene Brink began the preliminary investigation to determine the fire's point of origin.
A fire investigator, in determining the cause of the fire, starts in the area of least damage, the outside of the house or the living room where there was no fire, and works back to the area of most damage.
The house was cluttered with books and magazines. Detectives opened them and found money hidden inside. But the victim's wallet was found empty on the table. As firefighters packed up, Fire Marshal Brink went down to the basement and inspected the debris, looking for some explanation for the blaze.
I want to show you why I'm convinced we had a set fire here. In our investigation, we determined that the fire had started in the basement. That's where the greatest burn had occurred. We found one area under the kitchen where the fire had burned on top of a pile of magazines. There was no heat-producing device in the area. We had a set fire at that one particular place. This was an arson.
La Crosse arson investigators checked the outside perimeter of the house. They needed to find out who started the fire and why. They noticed a broken basement window. Investigators believed whoever started the fire may have entered through that window. In the snow, one of them discovered an undisturbed shoe print leading away from the house. Since it was dark, he covered the print with a metal trash can in order to preserve this possible clue. The autopsy was performed at the Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. The medical examiner found deep circular wounds in the victim's skull. The force of the blows caused severe hemorrhaging and trauma, rendering him unconscious and unable to escape the fire. Now, along with arson, authorities believed they were also investigating a murder.
Okay, everybody, we want to get a briefing in and get some job assignments.
Early the next morning, at the La Crosse Police Department, investigators compared the information they gathered so far. Detective Joe Dunham was one of the lead investigators on the case.
The coroner thought it was a gunshot, but then he determined later it was a blunt instrument to the head that killed Mr. Harmachek. There's a footprint on the east side of the house in snow.
Detectives also needed to follow up on the most promising clue so far, the footprint left in the back of the house. At the crime scene, technicians arrived to make a cast of the frozen shoe print. The snow's hardened crystalline structure captured the most intricate detail, but it had to be handled carefully so as not to destroy the print. Before a cast was attempted, the shoe print was photographed just in case. Hot sulfur, which solidifies on contact with the cold snow, was used as the casting medium. The sulfur hardens almost instantly, ensuring the snow does not melt before the cast is created. It recorded every groove and pattern of the shoe print. The newly formed cast was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. Inside the house, blood spatter stained the furniture and the surrounding floor. Forensic scientist Nick Stalkey reconstructed the fatal scenario.
The stains that were on the front of this chest of drawers were 2 to 6 millimeters in size. Those are indicative of stains that you would see at a beating or a stabbing.
He stretched pieces of string back from the blood spatter to determine the position of the victim at the moment of the attack.
By the point of convergence of the bloodstains, I was able to determine that Mr. Harmasek was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers. We did find a hammer that was in the area of these bloodstains.
The chest of drawers and the hammer were sent to the crime lab for analysis. A La Crosse police officer spoke with Shirley Otto, the victim's longtime companion.
So right now you can't think of anybody that would want to do any harm to him?
She and Donald Harmasek had been together for over 20 years. She told the officer they had a good relationship, that Donald was well-liked, and everyone called him by his nickname, Pops. Shirley also told the officer that Donald had been upset recently because his house had been repeatedly burglarized.
I think he kept most of it there because he didn't trust banks.
La Crosse police detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey looked into police reports and arrest records involving burglaries of the Harmasek residence. They found no shortage of names. It appeared perpetrators considered Donald Harmasek an easy mark.
He was someone that we knew kept money in his residence, and he had been targeted in the past by various burglars.
Police went to question a known local petty thief named Adam Tallbridge. But when he heard the police, he ran. Tallbridge looked like a promising suspect.
What is this all about? Apparently running for a reason.
Back at the station, he denied any involvement with the Harmasek homicide. Tallbridge claimed he panicked when he heard the police. That is why he ran. He agreed to cooperate and allowed his tennis shoes to be tested. They were sent out for analysis to the State Crime Lab, where forensic scientist Jerry Kotajarvi was analyzing the footprint casts from the crime scene.
There are a lot of shoes that have the same size and tread designs, but it's the unique characteristics that identifies that shoe to that impression. Like cuts and missing pieces and wear and so on.
He determined that the footwear worn at the scene was an Airwalk tennis shoe, the same type worn by Tallbridge. But when he compared the casts to the sneakers, he found the shoes were the wrong size. Adam Tallbridge was not their man. Then Kotajarvi discovered something unusual. There were actually two separate and distinct shoe prints, one on top of the other. He concluded they were now looking for two suspects, not one. Detective Berkey realized they had to rethink their investigation.
Detective Van Dunham and I both believed that there might be more to this. I mean, that information pointed us in the right direction.
Investigators still had no idea who killed Donald Harmasik, and they faced an even greater challenge. They were now looking for 2 suspects, and their hope was that the newly discovered shoe prints would lead them straight to the killers. 64-year-old Donald Harmasik was murdered and his house set on fire to cover up the crime. Investigators discovered they were now searching for 2 suspects, but so far the crime scene yielded a limited number of clues, and detectives Brad Berkey and Joe Dunham were frustrated.
When you burn a body, you take a lot of evidence with it, and also when you burn the home, you take a lot of evidence there. It was a challenge. We had a big challenge ahead of us because we had no suspects in this brutal murder.
At the crime lab, forensic scientists continued their investigation. Nick Stalkey studied the victim's blood-spattered cabinet. Soot marks and spatter indicated that one of the drawers was partially open at the time of the murder. The chest of drawers provided Nick Stalkey with important information.
The individual was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers, and then the drawers were repositioned, and then the fire started. It told us then that not only did the individuals beat the victim, but they also then ransacked that house after he was down and bleeding, and then started the fire and left.
Investigators now believe the perpetrator set the fire with the intent to cover up an even greater crime. At the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, forensic scientist Ken Olson tested debris from the burned house. He believed a flammable liquid was used to start the blaze.
It's very difficult to just take materials that are present to start a fire, but with an ignitable liquid, you can accelerate that fire and get it going faster.
Liquid accelerants leave traces behind that slowly evaporate. The debris collected was placed inside a can along with a carbon strip. Carbon absorbs any traces of the accelerant left behind. The can is sealed and then heated to 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
I then take that paint can with the charcoal strip inside, place it into the oven.
After heating for 16 hours, the carbon strip is then put into a gas chromatograph that analyzes the chemical components of the accelerant.
I take that vial and put it on the instrument, and it's automated, injects the solvent into the instrument, and I'm looking for any known accelerants that are there.
Every chemical has a unique molecular fingerprint. The chromatograph reveals that molecular structure.
I examined the residues that I recovered and found the residues of gasoline in 3 of the samples that were collected from the scene.
Investigators turned to the community, and they set up a Crime Solvers tip line. The leads began to pour in. One of the callers claimed a man named Todd Carpenter knew something about the murder. Detectives brought Carpenter in for questioning. He began to spell out his involvement, telling investigators he was contacted by 2 men.
He was approached by Nathan Lindell and Josh Lindell, and that he was a driver and they were just going there for a burglary.
According to Carpenter, the Lindell brothers heard a rumor that Donald Harmasik kept lots of cash in his house, and they wanted it. The brothers offered Carpenter money to drive the getaway car. Carpenter told the detectives he stayed with the car while Nathaniel and Josh Lindell committed the burglary.
He waited outside while Josh and Nathan Lindell went inside the residence looking for money and rummaged around the basement and went upstairs looking for money. And at that time, they stumbled across Donald Harmachek.
Afterwards, the brothers instructed him to drive to the top of Granddad Bluff, a secluded spot overlooking the city of La Crosse. There, they built a fire and burned the clothes they had been wearing, including their shoes. Carpenter was surprised when Nathaniel told him the man inside the house was, quote, toast by now.
What's he doing? Tyler, come on, let's get out of here.
The brothers paid Carpenter his money. In total, they had stolen $300 from Harmachek. Carpenter said he got nervous when he heard about the murder on the news the next day. Detectives ran the Lindell brothers' names through the computer. Josh Lindell's record was clean, but Nathaniel had a rap sheet riddled with prior arrests, including burglary.
Okay, Marcus.
Investigators began to believe Carpenter, but they had no concrete evidence to back up his story. In the hopes of getting some, detectives convinced him to wear a wire. Maybe they could catch Nathaniel incriminating himself. Carpenter went to see Nathaniel.
Hey, Marcus, man, what's up? What's going on, man?
He told him the police were asking a lot of questions.
Hey, calm down. Hey, come in quick.
He said he was scared. He didn't know what to do or say.
No. They just been coming by my work, asking me all kinds of questions, about who I was with and who I hang
Nathaniel
out with.
played it cool. He indicated knowledge of the crime, but said nothing that could actually incriminate himself.
He was telling him to stay cool and just, don't tell him anything, and that those SOBs, they ain't gonna get nothing out of me.
They were convinced Nathaniel Lindell was the mastermind. But the wired conversation was no proof. Since Carpenter couldn't help them anymore, detectives hoped Josh Lindell could.
He did agree to speak with us, and that surprised me. His initial statement to us, he took the blame.
Detectives finally got the break they needed. But the extreme violence of the crime and their strongest piece of evidence, the shoe prints, pointed to two killers. Detectives knew they needed more if they were to catch them both. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives were deep in the middle of the arson murder investigation of 64-year-old Donald Harmachek. The footprints found in the snow led investigators to two suspects, the Lindell brothers. Detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey had placed Josh Lindell in custody. Although he claimed he acted alone, the detectives knew differently. Detective Brad Berkey hoped Josh would give up his brother.
I believed that he was involved, but I never expected him in the interview to tell us that he was the one that did this. I fully expected him to tell us that his brother was more involved than he was, and that surprised me. He was remorseful that he did this, felt bad about it. He was trying to make some amends by telling us what he did.
Although Josh was taking the blame, in order to prove their case, detectives needed him to reveal his brother's involvement. Josh appeared nervous. He said he had never been in trouble with the law. And after hours of questioning, Josh Lindell finally admitted the whole story. He said he and Nathaniel broke in through the basement window, stepping on each other's footprints to obscure their tracks and to throw off police.
So we're gonna look for those.
They found Donald Harmachek asleep on the couch and panicked.
I was scared. It scared me, and I panicked and I hit him over the head.
Are you willing to speak with us in regard to this?
He said his brother Nathan also repeatedly struck the victim in the head with a hammer and left him for dead.
What's your present address?
Then they set the house on fire to cover up their crime. Josh's story matched Todd Carpenter's.
Exactly. Tell him to come on. Let's go.
He said they drove up to the bluff so he and his brother could burn their clothes and destroy evidence. Murder was never part of the plan. Although by the time they left, the plan had fallen apart.
Yeah, we weren't sure. I thought maybe we found him.
After Josh's confession, investigators had what they needed to bring in Nathaniel for breaking and entering, arson, and the murder of Donald Harmasic. They arrested him at the apartment he shared with his roommate.
And place you in the squad car after he searches you. When we get down to the police station, then we'll discuss.
He was
this at
handcuffed
that time.
and taken to the police station, where he was booked. Detectives also came armed with a search warrant. They questioned Nathaniel's roommate and searched for evidence. Even though Josh said they burned the shoes they wore, investigators collected another pair at his apartment. At the State Crime Lab, the shoes confiscated from Nathaniel were determined to be Airwalks, the same style and tread design of the shoe print cast. Although not an exact match, the wear pattern was uniquely similar to those worn at the crime scene. Despite the evidence against him and the fact that both Todd Carpenter and his own brother Josh incriminated him, Nathaniel Lindell refused to talk.
He would not speak to us. That's his right, of course. But Nathan is cold-hearted, would do anything.
Based on the evidence, police determined that Nathaniel and Josh Lindell broke into Donald Harmasic's home, intending to burglarize it. Josh was surprised to find the homeowner asleep on the sofa. Harmasic began to stir. Josh panicked. Nathaniel then struck him with the hammer he'd used to break the basement window, beating him unconscious. On their way out, the brothers took the money from the victim's wallet. They set the house on fire to cover up the murder. They then carefully stepped in each other's footprints, hoping to fool the authorities. It didn't turn out that way.
I believe Josh was definitely part of the crime, but he was not the leader of the group. It was Nathan Lindell, his older brother, that was the leader.
On February 3rd, 1998, Nathaniel Lindell was convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and arson. He was sentenced to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 50 years. His brother, Josh Lindell, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. He will be eligible for parole in 25 years. In exchange for his testimony, Todd Carpenter was not charged. La Crosse homicide detectives narrowed in on one piece of forensic evidence, yielding two suspects who used arson to hide their crime. In Florida, authorities faced an ever-widening challenge as a string of similar fires became more than a coincidence. In the early morning of August 7th, 1993, in Spring Hill, Florida, the Hernando County Fire Department responded to a burning residence. Firefighters raced to the home of 80-year-old Becky Saunders. When they arrived, the flames had already ravaged a large portion of the house. The extreme heat was overwhelming, and the entrances were blocked. But the firefighters did all they could to rescue the elderly resident and salvage her home. It took hours, but the firefighters finally got the fire under control. Forensic specialist Gary Kimball investigated.
Due to the extensive nature of the fire, we ran into some problems. We were unable to examine a lot of the things that we would like to have examined because they just weren't there anymore.
The heat was so intense, any potential evidence was destroyed. Investigators were unable to identify an immediate cause. Firefighters could not save Becky Saunders, an elderly widow who lived alone. She died at the scene. Police interviewed Becky Saunders' neighbor. He told investigators she didn't smoke, but she often fell asleep with the TV and lights on. He mentioned a possible electrical problem. The house had been struck by lightning a month or two earlier. Perhaps it had caused some damage that led to the fire. All the neighbors knew Becky and were eager to talk about her. They said she was in good health and quite independent. Fire investigators asked if anyone saw anything unusual. No one did. The Hernando County Sheriff's Arson Unit, led by Detective Mike Owens, searched for answers. When they could not determine the fire's immediate cause, they needed to consider another possibility: arson.
Arson investigation is not an exact science. It's a big puzzle. You try to take charred remains and then put them back together. We take everything in the room out and try to reproduce the locations of the furniture, everything and anything that was in there, and try and see where you're having low burns, high burns, to see what area the fire actually traveled.
The debris collected from the house was sent to the lab for analysis. Arson expert Carl Chasteen looked for pore patterns or the residue of a flammable chemical, an accelerant, that would indicate arson.
What we're trying to determine is, has there been something added to this fire scene that would cause it to burn faster and hotter than it would if it were an accidental fire? That's what we're looking for. We're looking to see if there's been an accelerant added to the fire.
The photographs revealed the progression of the fire, which started in the bedroom. Investigators still needed to find out the cause of the fire. But with so much of the evidence destroyed, they knew it would not be easy.
In a crime laboratory, we have to be objective. It's not our job to convict somebody or exonerate anyone. It's our job to test the evidence and tell the truth. In this case, we looked at it as closely as we could, and we still could not determine that there was any ignitable liquid in the samples.
At the medical examiner's office, the victim's remains were autopsied. Though her blood showed elevated levels of carbon monoxide, indicating that she had inhaled smoke, Dr. Valerie Rao wasn't confident that it was enough to suffocate her. The poor condition of her remains made further analysis impossible.
Because the investigation really did not lead anywhere, it was decided by the medical examiner to call it undetermined.
Without any evidence to indicate otherwise, Becky Saunders' death remained a mystery. Investigators were left with unanswered questions. The firefighters in Hernando County would soon find themselves battling another blaze. But maybe this could provide some answers. An elderly Spring Hill, Florida resident, Becky Saunders, died trapped inside her burning house. Investigators were unable to determine the actual cause of the fire.
Fire rescue, what is your emergency?
10 days later, the Hernando County dispatcher received a call. Another house was on fire, and an elderly couple was trapped inside.
Wait, sir, they'll be right there.
Firefighters entered the smoke-filled house and saw a woman collapsed on the floor. They carefully carried her to safety. A man was trapped unconscious in the back of the house.
I've got a second victim.
The victims, Mr. and Mrs. Ted Burton, were an elderly couple in poor health. They were rushed to the hospital. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel investigated.
Someone had broken into the home, had beaten the elderly lady. Her husband in the bedroom heard the commotion, came out. He was beaten, and then they attempted to set a drape on fire and left.
Investigators noticed a bystander engrossed by the rescue. Because entry was forced and the victims were beaten, detectives questioned everyone in the area, including the bystander. His name was Brian Searsley. He said he lived in the neighborhood and that he'd seen nothing suspicious. He agreed to let investigators swab his hands for the telltale signs of an accelerant. He also allowed them to take an article of clothing for further testing. The fire had gone out only moments after it had started. The arson dog was sent in, and investigators collected debris to test for accelerants. If an accelerant was used, detectives believed it might point them in the direction of a suspect.
There was some alcohol poured in a dish with a candle. The candle was lit and then put underneath the drapes, and the drapes caught on fire.
The rest of the house remained undamaged. It was searched thoroughly, looking for anything out of the ordinary. In the bathroom, investigators noticed a cabinet door open. Not sure what it could mean, the cabinet was dusted for prints. At the State Arson Lab, Brian Searsley's clothes, as well as the swabs and samples from the Burton house, were analyzed. Traces of gasoline were found on his clothes, but there was no evidence of gasoline at the crime scene. He was eliminated as a suspect. Police studied crime scene photographs, hoping to spot something they'd missed. Mrs. Burton suffered from Alzheimer's, and Mr. Burton had lapsed into a coma, so the couple was unable to aid investigators. They found no evidence that the similarities between the Burton fire and the Saunders fire was anything more than coincidence.
Right off the edge of the carport. Now, we know it wasn't a robbery, because as we were going through the home, we opened up the drawer in the bedroom, and that's a picture of the drawer opened up in the bedroom. And if you'll notice, you can start to see a wallet, a man's wallet. When we picked up the wallet and opened it up, it had a lot of cash in it, so we know it wasn't a robbery.
With no known motive and no possible suspects, the evidence baffled investigators. Later that day, another fire was reported in a neighboring town.
Singapore radio. You have fire on the scene now.
We've received a call that there was a fire up in Brookridge. Again, the fire was hot and it had burnt severely to where everything in the bedroom had dropped onto the ground. We processed that scene looking for anything we could find.
Like the first victim, 70-year-old Monique Jenkins had been found burned beyond recognition on her bed. And like the last fire, a bathroom cabinet stood open. Once again, most of the evidence was destroyed, but investigators collected what they could from the smoldering debris. The body was burned beyond recognition. At autopsy, the medical examiner was unable to find the cause of death. The examiners did find the victim's hands were bound with duct tape, rendering her helpless. Examiners found no fingerprints on the tape. Again, there was no clear motive for the crime.
The detectives approach us and they're looking for anything they can find that will forensically link something or someone to these cases. They're wanting to know if we got fingerprints. They're wanting to know if we got any trace evidence, if we found any accelerants, or anything that they can put their hands on to help them in the direction they're going in this case. And at this particular time, we were not able to come up with anything. Very frustrating for the whole team.
Okay, folks, we're here today to review the facts that we've come up with thus far.
Detectives compared evidence gathered at the 3 fires, hoping to come up with something that would tie them together.
We had a great amount of intense heat inside this master bedroom.
Appears to be some type of home invasion at this point when both the victims were...
The intensity of the blaze indicated an accelerant was used to cover up another crime.
Once we examined the remains, we clearly showed that she had been duct taped with her hands clearly duct taped behind her back. So that's really the first indication that we're dealing with something other than accidental fires.
This was the crucial piece of evidence that began to link the arsons.
Because now we know we had a problem. We felt now we have somebody going around breaking in homes and burning these elderly women up.
Police followed through on several leads. None paid off. Worried, a man checked on his neighbor, Rita Talbot, after he hadn't seen her for a few days. Her front porch was littered with unread newspapers. She didn't answer the door. With the key she had given him, the neighbor entered the house.
Hello? Hello?
He found her in the bedroom, dead. Once again, police were called. They were all too familiar with this neighborhood. In fact, Rita Talbot lived on the same block as Becky Saunders, the first fire victim.
Scott? Hey, Russ.
What do we got going?
Looks like another one. I haven't been in the scene yet, but we have, we're doing some processing out on the side of the house. Got an open window, looks like it could be our point of entry. And
but this crime scene was different. The house did not catch fire. Detective Mike Owens noticed the stains around the bed.
What we've got is, looks like a pour pattern, Scott. Looks like we've got some alcohol bottles up there on the bed. And what they may have done, or might have been done here, is alcohol poured in the carpet. And not enough with this carpet to substantiate a burn, but it melted all the carpet down. Look at this pattern. Look how deep it is.
how about the bed? Did the bed get anything?
Looking at the bed. If you look over here, we don't have...
The crime scene technicians dusted for fingerprints. This time, they found one. The print was lifted and sent to the lab for analysis. They collected samples of the carpet, hoping the fibers would yield clues. Cigarette butts and some empty alcohol bottles were recovered. After weeks of frustration, this tragic crime scene produced several key clues. Now, detectives hoped the forensic evidence would bring them closer to capturing the killer. For almost 2 months, detectives had been tracking a killer who was wreaking havoc on a peaceful Florida neighborhood. At the most recent crime scene, police found several clues, including a fingerprint they hoped would lead them to a suspect. Detective Scott Bierweiler believed the recovery of this evidence was crucial.
The past houses of the victims, of the deceased, had been burned. A lot of the evidence had been destroyed. We were not real successful in obtaining evidence. So we were all encouraged going into this house, knowing that it was most likely going to be tied with the other victims, same suspect in this. And if we were going to obtain any type of evidence, our best shot was to get it out of this particular house.
Fingerprints were also lifted from a vehicle parked in the latest victim's garage. At autopsy, it was revealed there were marks left by the duct tape used to tie her hands behind her back. She had been strangled. All but 2 of her ribs were broken and her neck was snapped. They also determined she was sexually assaulted. Inside her throat, the medical examiner found a single hair. As detectives gathered their evidence, news of the murder spread. Detective Tom Holly received an anonymous tip.
While I was finishing up my paperwork, I was working late last night, and I got this anonymous phone call from a female who tried to disguise her voice and kind of only whispered. But she said she knew who the killer was from Spring Hill, and she gave me the name of Edwin Caprat.
So we should have some good quality prints to compare with those of that. What was his name? Caprat, you said?
Caprat.
It's going to hinge on forensics at this point.
Forensic specialist Gary Kimball compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those on file. Detectives learned Caprat had a long history of arrests.
Well, he does have a criminal history. He's a convicted felon out of Hillsborough County. And 91, we have a homicide, willful kill, first degree, robbery, and forgery from Tampa PD. And
they also learned Caprat performed odd jobs for several of the victims. One detective remembered interviewing him at the first crime scene. Kimball believed he was onto something. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel examined the findings, looking for certain characteristics, such as identical loops and patterns. They were eager to share the news.
We got some good news. Gary Kimball just made 2 of your late cases off the Caprat case. Caprat is your man. He's the guy.
But since Caprat was a local handyman and worked for several of the victims, his prints could be easily explained.
And one off the car in the garage.
They needed more.
Wonderful. He's your man.
That's great. Scratch too.
So, Daniel, another one, man?
For 2 weeks, Caprat was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Their goal was to collect more physical evidence. After he left a local bar, detectives took one of Caprat's cigarette butts, hoping to match his DNA to the saliva on the cigarettes recovered at the crime scene, and to the hair found lodged in the victim's throat. The DNA matched. It was the connection they needed. Detectives obtained an arrest warrant and went to the suspect's most recent residence. Michael Caprat was placed under arrest for the most recent arson murder of Rita Talbot. In a room lined with photos of the crime scenes and the many files police had collected, detectives questioned Caprat.
Prior to even interviewing, we knew that he was our guy, so we pushed forward with it. And Detective Douglas and myself kind of took on the good guy, bad guy detective.
At first, he denied everything. But when confronted with the evidence, he confessed.
Once we started our interview, we couldn't shut him up, basically. He just talked on and on and on and on.
During the 3-hour interview, he confessed to murders of 3 women, as well as the 4 arsons. Caprat was charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder and 3 counts of rape.
The forensics evidence clinches the case for us, but there's nothing like a confession.
According to his confession, Michael Caprat chose elderly victims because he believed they were vulnerable. He broke into their homes and crept into their rooms. He would restrain his victims with duct tape, then proceed to rape and beat them. He poured rubbing alcohol that he took from their own bathrooms, spilling it on and around their beds. He then lit a match. For his crimes, Michael Caprat was sentenced to death. On April 19, 1995, he was killed by another death row inmate. Fire can be used as a powerful weapon. Killers who choose it know little is left in its wake.
Hey guys, how we doing?
Though some hope it will successfully hide their crimes, many perpetrators discover forensic evidence can survive long after the fire is out. And their trial by fire leads directly to justice.